and then what I will do is I'm gonna minimize all you guys on my screen here. There we go. I actually would have, which is the best way to do this, like this way. Okay. If you need to share screen at all, Kathy, you can do that. There shouldn't be any
Okay.
restrictions to that.
Okay. I'm not, but
Okay. Okay.
so
So for you, for those of you who don't know Kathy, I've known Kathy a number of years. We worked together at SUNY Adirondack. She has far more experience than just her time at SUNY Adirondack, but her specialty has always been working with students who don't have the comfort level that maybe some of their peers do in the classroom. And so when Kathy mentioned trying to do a session for us on language experience, which is one of my favorite techniques, I was so thrilled to have her come in. She's very good at explaining things. So like she said, if at any point you have questions, ideas, please feel free to ask her. She is just an incredible wealth of knowledge. Okay. So please
thanks,
feel
Roseanne.
free to ask her questions.
Okay, I'll just give you a very brief rundown of my life, my experiences in education. So I graduated from Plattsburgh in '81 as secondary English, and I got my first teaching job at Lake George, and I was teaching 7th grade, and I learned very quickly that a lot of my 7th graders were not comprehending, and nothing in my experience of being an English teacher, metaphors, paragraphing, nothing really prepared me to help these kids learn how to read. So, I mean, they were word callers and they could read a textbook, they could kind of skim and find the answer and jot it down, but a lot of my students were not really comprehending. So I went to SUNY Albany and I got my master's in reading, and that fascinated me. I was kind of in love with the whole science. So I taught at Lake George for 8 years. And then I took a leave and I was working on my doctorate at SUNY Albany in reading. And then I went to the college, and they had never had non-credit reading before. We were lagging behind a lot of the other colleges. So I was put in charge of the non-credit reading program, and we started the Center for Reading and Writing. And so I was there for 13 years. And I loved working with adults. It was fascinating to have an 18-year-old in the same classroom with somebody who's in her 60s was so interesting. And then when my son started kindergarten, I kind of said, I kind of miss junior high. I really like middle school. And my colleagues at the college were like, what? Are you crazy? And then I went back and I went to Glens Falls for 13 more years. To teach, and reading has always been my fascination. My goal to make students that really didn't like reading or couldn't read. So I've developed some tips and some ideas about what to do. But language experience has always been very appealing to me. Basically, it's using people's personal experiences combined with oral language to create some positive experience in literacy. And so I'm going to give you 3 different examples that I've used so that you can kind of see how it might fit in with the people that you're working with. And it's 3 different ages. So is anybody working with young people, or are most of you working with older students?
The students need to be at least 18 years of age, but
Okay.
that still leaves you a pretty broad range of individuals.
Okay.
I'm trying to think here. I'm looking around at the faces, and I would say probably we're talking about people mostly 40s, late 30s,
Okay.
40s, and
Okay.
some early 50s. So kind of in that.
Okay. So I'll share an experience with somebody from the college who I was working with in the Center for Reading and Writing. And he was not an experienced reader at all. And he was a mechanic. So I asked him to tell me about his experiences, what his typical day in the garage looks like. And so while he was talking to me, I was writing down everything that he was saying, because somebody's oral language is often, especially people who aren't readers, their oral language is usually much richer than what they can actually read, what they can actually write. But their speaking language, it's a little different when you have somebody who's a practiced reader, but an unpracticed reader has some language in there that they wouldn't necessarily recognize in print. And so when he told me his story, I wrote it down, and then I read it back to him for clarification, because some of the words he was using about engines and things I wasn't quite sure about. He went over some other kinds of tools, and then I gave it to him to read to me. And then he read it back. You'd think he'd be really fluent with it, but he was a little bit halting. And then I told him I wanted him to practice and to come back, and that gives you an opportunity to work with somebody on punctuation and fluency, so that you know, they're paying attention to things that, you know, practice readers pay attention to, like they're paying attention to when they completely stop, when there's a comma and they take a breath. And then I take the opportunity to say, you know, what would be a cool word to stick in here? I'm going to add, and I would add maybe a word he wouldn't typically use. Like if I said intermittently, you know, so I could kind of add an extra word in there that he might not know. And then before we start our next session, he would reread his story to me, and then he would add to it. And so it's using his own experiences in his own language and giving him fluency. So it's kind of like, I would say, emergent literacy for little kids. Like sometimes I've worked with young children and their parents would say, I don't really think that they're reading. I think they've just got this memorized. And I say to them, you know, that's the beginning of really reading, and they're starting to pay attention to letters and sounds. And that's the beginning. So even if it's something that it seems like they've memorized because they know it so well, they're actually developing more skill and more confidence. And also, when you're working with a student and they're talking about their own experiences, you're learning, and they realize that they have something to offer to you, that there's a whole body of information that they know. So sometimes people that are coming for reading instruction have this sense that they are, you know, not bright. So it gives you the opportunity to be able to say, you have this whole wealth of knowledge, and reading is just one skill level, but you also know all this other stuff. So that's really, I think, the beauty of language experience, working with adults, especially. I'll just tell you quick, I have 2 other language experience stories that I like to share. I had a student in the high school, and that was a problem child. She was always in school suspension. She was a fighter, for sure. And her literacy level was very low. She really was not a reader. And I had her in something called AIS, Academic Intervention Services. And so it was a small class, 6 or 7, and the students had notebooks, and we did things together, and they wrote. But I had her so much to myself in the in-school suspension room that we actually wrote stories, and she would practice them, and she would come in during lunch, and she would read to me, and then we'd add a couple sentences, and the whole class, she was completely immersed in rereading her own. She was feeling very proud of herself. And her behavior in that class was so different because she was engaged. She knew she was growing, and I never asked her to share anything with the other students, so they didn't know what she was working on. But her reading improved so much just by being able to write her own story. So it wasn't her actual experience, but it was a fictionalized story that she was engaged in and she enjoyed. And again, I added 2 or 3 words each time to kind of raise the level a little bit. So she could say, okay, now these are some words that I know. So I think that was important. And the last one that I'll share with you was funny because it was when I was teaching 7th grade, and I had my students doing a class story. So we would have a word of the day. So it was vocabulary building. And every day as the students came in, I had it on the overhead. That will tell you how long ago that was. We used overheads. And I had a story that started Mario accelerated down the track, blah, blah, blah. And then we added each time and the word was accelerated. And when I started teaching at Glens Falls High School, a very popular history teacher, Kirk Conduzio, he was one of my 7th graders back in the day. And when he saw me, he said, "Miss Herold, I can't believe I'm teaching with you." And I said, "Oh, call me Kathy," because I was old by then. And he said, "I still remember that story." And he said, "The red car accelerated." And I was like, oh, so he could remember the whole story. So I think it's pretty impactful when students have control of the language, when they're repeating it, when it starts orally. So the value of oral language for the low reader is really important. I shouldn't say low reader, the unpracticed readers. So I think that's an important aspect of it. So I don't know if you want to share now or I had an activity, but I will let you decide. Do you want to throw something in? Has anybody used this effectively? Can anybody imagine how they might use it with their student? No? Okay, so why don't I have you guys do some writing? Does anybody have something to write with? So I think it's important to talk about what people do, their work. And so if you would write just a paragraph about what it is that you do, whether you're doing volunteer work or whether you're getting getting paid for something, if you can just write a paragraph explaining maybe a little piece of your typical day, that would be great. And then I'm going to talk about the different speaking, listening, writing, and reading. So if you could write a paragraph, that would be great. Okay, I'll start by reading mine. And I want to just kind of talk about the difference between our reading vocabularies and our writing vocabularies and our speaking vocabularies and our listening vocabulary, because when we're working with students, we want all the words that they come across to kind of go all across all four of those different groups of words that we know that we can access, but we want them to be able to access them when they speak, when they listen, when they read, and when they write. So I'm just going to read mine real quick. Right now, most of my working hours are voluntary. I deliver Meals on Wheels for recipients in the Brant Lake area. The elderly are often living alone, unable to drive, and isolated. While we are officially driving hot meals, we are unofficially a cure for the loneliness felt by so many. One mother with a disabled son said that we are their only visitors all week. Our route begins at 9:30 and ends at 12:30. A new recipient lives on the top of a winding, circuitous gravel driveway, which I don't want to even imagine this winter. We'll make it work because we feed both body and spirit. So when I wrote this, I actually went back and changed some of the words, or at least thought about, what do I call them? Recipients? Does that work? And then I said, the driveway's like, so I thought about circuitous. I mean, I think that the languages that we use, speaking is so spontaneous. So a lot of the words that we're using when we're speaking are not necessarily higher level or advanced, or things that we would do when we write, because we can go back and really think about it and say, okay, now what do I want to put in here to make that clearer? And I think certainly our the students that we work with, their oral vocabulary is typically more advanced than their reading, which is kind of a flip. So when they hear something, they've got access to all the words because they can hear it, unless they're, English language. I should mention that if they're not native language learners, I forgot if they're not ESL, it's the old fashioned way of saying it, but, they might struggle more with oral language. But for students for people who don't have a lot of practice reading, when they hear it and they hear it in context and they know how it's pronounced, a lot of times their listening vocabulary is much higher than their reading vocabulary. And then their speaking and writing tends to be less, unless they can access it by reading. So it's important, I think, to think about all four of those. And does anybody want to share what you wrote and talk about the words that you think maybe you added because you wrote and you had to think about it? Or maybe everything you wrote is spontaneous.
I can read mine if nobody else wants to share at the moment. I said, I help people who need, you know what? And this isn't even really the way, now that I think about it, this isn't even really the way I speak, but I help people who need help with improving their literacy skills. Some of the individuals who come to me have much better skills than they realize. I also work with an amazing group of volunteers who help their learners grow and obtain the self-confidence they need to succeed.
See how we change it? Like you said, you probably wouldn't say it that way, but because you're writing, you've got a way to formulate it that's a little bit different. Hi, Sherry. Are you still teaching? Nephew's got.
Retired.
Oh, you're
I
retired?
Retired in June of. Yes.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah.
Did you write about teaching?
Thank you. They offered me a very. I did. Well, no, I wrote about being a literary volunteer. Would you like to read? Would you like to read?
Yes.
And I did add on. So I'll tell you what I added on. But I said I'm a new literary volunteer tutor. I'm working, and I added on, I'm working with my first. Originally, I just said I'm working with a lady, but I'm working with my first lady, with my first learner, a lady from the Ukraine. She understands English pretty well, as she was in the USA as a child for a year or so. but she needs help with speaking and pronunciation. I assign her a homework article that I have her read, asking, and it also goes along with an audio version. Having trouble reading my writing, I wrote quickly. And then the next lesson, she reads the article to me. We work on words that she's unsure of, either the pronunciation or the definition or both. I'm amazed at her improvement over the short 2.5 months that we have been together. She's improved greatly.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So, do you think that
So
she
I would
has a
go-
harder time?
Thank you. A harder time what? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, do you think she has a
That's
harder
fine.
time when she's trying to hear something when she's listening rather than having it right in front of her? What do you think?
It's a combination. So she sees the words and she hears them, but sometimes the articles read too fast. So Roseanne has been helping me with ideas of how we can slow down the speaking part.
Wow, great. Oh, that's great. Does anybody else want to share either what they wrote or how things are going with their student? Linda, I think you need to turn off the
Yeah, okay.
Hi,
Can you hear me now?
Linda. Yes. Hi,
Yeah.
Linda, how are you? I recognized you. I had your son Dan in 7th grade,
Oh, really?
Lake
Oh
George.
my God. He's 49 now.
Shh.
He has 2 kids. They're 10 and 12. My grandchildren. Well, I'm retired and I spend most of my days partly at home and partly in town. I go to exercise classes 3 times a week, and also I have a very active dog that I have to exercise with. But I recently purchased a new sewing machine, so I'm in the middle of the learning curve with that. And I'm very involved with my quilt guild. I'm the secretary for the guild, and I'm involved with the quilt show, and in the middle of getting a lot of things ready to put in the show. And then I belong to 2 other quilt groups that I basically meet 4 times a month with different quilting groups.
Wow,
And,
obviously.
so, and also I'm studying Spanish in my spare time on Duolingo, which isn't going that well. So I think I'm going to use the paid one because the free one only lets you go so far and then they cut you off. But my learner is Asian, and she appears to speak very well, but she writes good stories. If we have a lot of fun writing stories together, and she writes stories, sends me emails of stories when we pick a topic, but she doesn't always understand what she's read. She'll read it, but she doesn't always understand it. I have to do a lot of explaining about things. And right now she's busy with a church bazaar. So she's cut her tutoring hours down to like an hour twice a week. We were doing an hour and a half twice a week, and I've offered her more, but that seems to be enough for her. So, we have fun. We do a lot of laughing, and, I explain things to her, and we use a lot of internet sources like Voice of America and News for You. And I've tried reading some books with her, but she never really gets what's going on in the books. We tried Little Women, and they were getting ready for a Christmas play, and she didn't really understand what it was about, or the whole thing between the sisters. She didn't understand it. So I've given up finding a novel for her to read, but I enjoy working with her greatly, and I enjoy working with her on Zoom because it's very convenient. And then I can get back to my sewing and walking my little dog.
Great. Yeah, I'm trying to think about what's gone on with her with
Is it just me or can nobody hear Kathy?
Can't hear Kathy.
Kathy, we can't hear you. Not sure what happened, Kathy, but we can't hear you. Kathy, can you hear us? Kathy? Is your mic, did you accidentally, it doesn't look like you're muted.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good. All right.
Not sure what happened there, but
Yeah,
The
I don't know
grem-
what happened there
gremlins.
either. But
gremlins.
there are shorter books, books in verse, and they don't have chapters. And there's a section of them. If you go to Crandall Library and you ask for some books in verse, they seem to be like less complicated, but still fictional. Does anybody have ever seen them before? Books in verse. They're young adult, but the topics are not insulting in any way. So they're good books. So check with the librarian for books in verse. That might work for a longer text.
So Kathy, just a quick question. So I have some of my folks here actually working with individuals who are studying to pass the GED. And writing and math seem to be the two least favorite things for learners to do for us. With math being far higher up the list than writing. But how can we use this to help just try to get them into reading, or not into reading, but just into writing, to practicing? I mean, to me, you know, they have to learn how to write certain particular types of essays. But I'm just wondering, you know, the hardest part is just getting them to write and to write properly formatted grammatical sentences first, before we even start talking about the topics of what they have to do for the GED.
Right.
What kind of things can you suggest that we could, how could we make this, you know, like bigger, so that way we can get more writing out of them? Because I love the idea, and I think it would probably be popular with most of the students, since it's something they know.
I think the most important thing with writing is that they're writing something that they know about. So part of the problem with the GED is if they have to write about something that's a science topic or something that's history, they might not feel the same comfort level with that material. So I think to get at the content first and have them list some of the information that they know, and then teaching them how to put those into sentences. So I think it's impossible to teach somebody how to write if they're trying to write something that they don't understand. So I think that's the challenge with the GED. I think that the assumption that they know the material and they can write about it if they know it, but if they don't know it, they can't write about it. So I think at the heart of that is often not understanding what it is that they're reading. So to use the language experience approach to actually have them talk about what it is that they know. So if the topic is something that happened in World War I, and then to say, what do you know about World War I? Let's start with that. And then if they don't know, then to go back to the text and try to make sure that they understand it before they begin to try to write. And I think with math, it's almost the same thing too. I mean, I think you have to, when you're doing math, you have to get them to say, you know, just go to the point. I mean, I think just like with reading, with anybody who's learning anything, you know, to start with what they know. And then, so can you copy down the problem? And then after you copy down the problem, do you know what to do next? And try to pinpoint where they get stuck, and then a model problem next to them. So then they can compare where it is that they get stuck and practice that way. But I think to always start, whether it's reading or math or writing, start with what they know first, and then always give them credit for what they know. I mean, to always try to make sense of something. I mean, at the very least, I've said to students, you know, I can see that it's important for you to make sense of things and you don't want to keep going because it doesn't make sense to you. And that's an important skill. So to always focus on the positive and work with what they know.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Mary?
Yeah, I wonder if I could ask, can you hear me? My computer apparently is not always good. Okay. So I'm working with a lovely lady who's working on her GED. She's very anxious about math, and so it keeps us from really, I mean, her language arts ability, I think are good, but she never wants it. She's so anxious that math is going to be so pervasive on the test that she doesn't want to spend time on the language arts.
Mhm.
And, you know, she's so agreeable, and yet you can feel her anxiety when I say, well, I think now we're going to come back to, you know, the main idea of the story, or I take some articles off. Roseanne has told me about Newsella.
Newsella and Newsfeed.
Anyway, that seems to make her, yeah, it seems to make her like feel, not that she would ever say it because she's too lovely. Like, I'm wasting her time. We really should be working on math.
I think because
And
math is so
yet,
concrete.
even with it, although,
So just so you know, Mary, out of all of the students that I take in, regardless of their level, there is a huge math phobia in this area.
oh,
It
okay.
is very pervasive amongst people at all different levels. Even tutors, when in the tutor training class, we start talking about the fact that they have to teach math, I can just see the eyes bugging out in people's heads. And when I start to explain to them, okay, but think about it, if you're teaching somebody to read, but they can't use measuring cups to read the recipe that you just taught them to read, have you taught them anything? Have we done them any good, right? So I'm not talking about, typically, I'm not talking about algebra or geometry. I'm usually talking about life math, things that you folks are using every single day, but some of these individuals aren't using it every day because they don't know. They don't know the difference between a cup and a teaspoon. They can't use that, but there is just a huge math phobia in this area. Usually pardon?
The GED has a huge expectation for what their math skills. I mean, it's pretty hard. But I think that, I mean, can she add and subtract and do multiplication? Yes. Okay.
But then you know, I feel like, so we did a few word problems, and, you know, word problems are reading, and sometimes, like all people doing word problems, you get the first sentence and then you think, okay, I know what they want. And so getting her to read just like whole article in a language arts, reading the whole problem to see what is really being asked for, that's hard. I feel she feels a tremendous pressure, self-imposed, that she needs to get this GED because of course she wants to move on. And at the moment, it's been difficult for me to convince her that we're just taking our time. We need to take our time and find out what we know and what we don't.
Yeah, math anxiety, like Roseanne said, is very common. And I think when I think about math, so I was, after I retired, I had to move back to Long Island to take, well, I didn't have to, but I moved back to Long Island to take care of my mother. And she was sick for about 5 years. And I became a consultant for area schools. I wasn't a very good consultant because I loved all the teachers and didn't want to. I just said, I honor you, you're doing a great job. But it was how to get the special education teachers to better work with the classroom teachers. And there was one woman that was assigned to the math class, a special educator, and she really was afraid of doing math. And she actually became the best teacher of math because when she tried to do the homework, she could then articulate what it was she was trying to do and share that with the students. So she was sharing and feeling their anxiety. So in the same way that I'm sure you guys do kind of some reciprocal teaching, that if she's got a math problem right there and you're articulating how you're solving it and she's articulating how she's solving it. And just like if you're trying to read Little Women with your student and you're jotting down what you're understanding in that particular section of the book, and then she can be, I mean, I think to be modeling the learning process next to them could reduce some anxiety for that math, the person who's doing math. Do you think that would something that would work with her if you were doing the problem right with her?
We actually do them together because my math skills, I'm not a teacher. That's not I was a nurse. So algebra is a long time ago for me. And so we do things together.
Good.
And we both make mistakes together. She see that seemed, I mean, we certainly do laugh a lot about my mistakes, but it's just, and I think it's helpful for me to know that this is kind of a pervasive thing, but she's just so anxious to do this and do it well so she can move on to the next piece of it, you know. And I do think she's in a GED program, and the program is always apparently, you know, you're going to have to know this on the GED. You're going to have to know this on the GED. So for me to say to her, yeah, but you know what, we're gonna start with adding fractions, and then we're gonna do the number line and that kind of thing. That's hard for her.
So Mary, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm thinking maybe Mary, because she's part of this, I think is because regardless of what you're doing, from what I'm hearing, is that the other program is causing the stress. So regardless of what you're doing, to me, it sounds like she's getting stress from another teacher. So maybe what we need to do is we need to let that other individual realize the pressure that they're sending. They're probably not meaning
Oh, I'm sure.
put this type of pressure on her, and they may not realize how she's reacting to it. So maybe it's some communication with the other instructor as well in the other program, because regardless of what you are saying, there may not be anything that you can do to mitigate the situation if she's getting a different message from somewhere else. So this may be some time when we have to do some collaborative work with the other organization.
Okay, thanks.
Does anybody else want to share what's going on with their student, if they have any concerns or anything that's really working, or Linda?
Well, yeah. All right. You were talking about teaching writing. So in Voice of America, level 2, the first or second lesson, they have this thing they call the hamburger paragraph. And I've used that with both of my learners, and they love it. They just completely understand it. You have the bun, you know, the top of the bun is the introductory sentence, and then the supporting facts are fillers, you know, like the hamburger, the lettuce, the tomato, the cheese. And then the bottom of the bun is the concluding sentence. And I use that with both of my learners, and they're very different levels. My first learner, I had to teach from the alphabet. My learner that I have now speaks very well, but she wasn't writing anything that made any sense. So that hamburger paragraph idea works great with people to get them started, because once I did that, I started getting a whole page of, you know, stories instead of just, you know, a sentence here and there. And the thing about the math, Mary, that you were saying, my first learner that I had did the same thing. He would jump right in, but he didn't read the question. And we used to have to go over that and say, I'd say, yes, that's a pie. I can see where you got that, but that's not what they want, you know? So that's where, you know, you have to just kind of show them that's the story. It's just, you have to back up a little bit. But he was a whiz at math. Too much of a whiz.
I know this is, you know, not exactly what you guys are working on, but when I used to go in, I found the best time to help kids with their homework was during free lunch in the cafeteria in the mornings. And this one kid came up to me and goes, Miss Herold, I know you're an English teacher, but I'm having a really hard time with my calculus. And I was like, oh. I said, okay, well, let me look at it. And all I did was read out loud the very first part of it. And he's like, oh, thanks. He goes, I can't believe you know calculus. And I laughed, but you know, the articulation of what is actually on the page, sometimes that whole idea, they're not answering the question, or they don't know what they're looking for necessarily, I think is important. Yeah. One time I was working with a student at the college, and it was math. He was in the writing center, but he was working on his math, and it was algebra, and it had like 5x plus 6 equals whatever. And then something occurred to me. I said, do you know what the X stands for? And he goes, that's the ones place. And I said, oh no, it's the unknown. And he was like, what? So sometimes just asking them what they know, where they're coming from, can uncover, you know, a complete misunderstanding of what is going on. Anybody else want to share, or do you have a concept for the language experience to try to get people to actually articulate experience? And I think that also follows through with learning, to try to get them to think about how they're approaching a task and articulate it. And then I think to always give a positive, you know, response to however it is they're approaching it, and then work from there. Laura, how old is your student that you're working with?
The woman I'm working with is 58.
Mm-hmm.
And she is I don't know what the term is, but she speaks Russian and Korean, and she also speaks English very well. And she is in the program. I guess she went to Roseanne because she wanted to speak to a native speaker and improve her speaking and her comprehension. And I found that her speaking and comprehension is actually really good. And we ended up, she wanted to get her learner's permit. So we actually worked together this summer and went through the learner's permit booklet, and she passed the test. And so she was away and then I was away. And so we haven't worked together. But by the way, Roseanne, she did just email me back. So we're back in touch.
Good.
Oh, that's great. Congratulations.
I haven't had to use, and my learner that I worked with last summer also was a non-native speaker. She didn't speak as well as the woman I'm working with now, but I haven't used too many of these techniques because I find that the people I'm working with, they actually are speaking and comprehending really well. So those are the only 2 people I've worked with, and I'm trying to figure out.
The nice thing about this though, Laura, is both people that came to me that I paired you with wanted to sound American. And so typically American English, we throw in a lot of words that aren't in proper British English. And we actually, English compared to the other languages, have a lot of just extra words that are of no use other than to make it correct grammar. And if you do something like this, you can probably pick out what things that they tend to leave out of their sentences that may not make them sound as American as they want to be.
Right. I can see that.
So
Mhm.
that might be good for getting those fine points. And also if they're reading back to you, it might actually be also the pronunciation. So the sound and the phonics of how they're articulating the words that they're saying. Because again, most people want to lose their accent.
Oh,
That's the
fair.
other thing that they're trying to get. So maybe it might be useful in that regard to try those two things.
Yeah, I can see how that would work. Yeah.
Anybody else want to share anything or have a question or a concern?
Well,
So
thank you,
I-
Kathy. I appreciate your time and I appreciate
Yeah.
everybody coming. This was really, really helpful. I'm excited. I love language experience. I just think it's a great way to, I just remember as a kid myself, you're in school, you're like, oh, what am I going to write about? And if you can give them a topic that's something that's super familiar to them, then that just makes it so much easier to have the word starts coming out, whether it's proper grammar, proper English, whatever, but just the art of getting them to start writing something down and then giving you material that you can work from. That is the easiest place to start. And so I just love this technique. I've heard so many people say that this has worked for them. So thank you, Kathy, for bringing
Yeah,
that out.
and if anybody ever wants me to come work with you or observe a session, or if you're feeling like you're kind of stuck, feel free. I can come down to the city and leave Chestertown and give you a hand. I would love that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else have any last ones for Kathy before we? All right.